Niisiis, inimesi tuleb juurde ka kaameraid ja aeg vaikselt juba tiksub, nii et peab peale hakkama. Nii paljude kaamerate ees ma tegelikult tahan korraks natukene Krista Kaera süüdistada. Lihtsalt niivõrd hea võimalus. Tähendab, loomulikult on Krista süüdi selles festivalis suuresti, aga ta on päris kindlasti süüdi ka selles, et mul on üsna mitu raamatut lugemata, kaasa arvatud näiteks see raamat seal. Sest kui Krista on nende raamatutega ametis olnud, siis ta on lihtsalt leekivi silmi niivõrd hästi need ümber jutustanud mingitel kokkusaamistel, et sellest tõrkest ülesaamine, et kas ma julgen lugema hakata, äkki ei olegi nii hea, kui oli see, mis Krista rääkis, see võtab natuke aega, aga siis, kui Krista on paar korda kinnitanud, et tegelikult ikkagi on veel parem, siis muidugi lõpuks saavad need raamatud ka loetud. Nii et süüdistustega selleks korraks ühel pool. Mida veel ütelda, minul ei olegi palju. Teame prantsuse keelest kena väljendit femme fatale, eesti keeles võiks, tähendab Eestis on olemas niisugune nähtus ja mitte ainult Eestis, mida võiks kirjeldada sõnapaariga mem total. Ja see võiks tähistada sellist jõulises keskeas naiskirjaniku, kellest ei saa üle ega ümber. Ja meil on neid siin täna päris mitu, alates laval viibivast ES Byattist kuni Aino Pervikuni välja. Nii et anname mem totalidele võimaluse tõelist Lady Powerit paisata. ES Byatt, Krista Kaer, olge hääd ja veel paremad.
So first of all, I'm very glad to see you sitting here and starting to talk. So let us start from the very beginning. When you started your writing career, was it difficult for you or did it come naturally to you because you grew up with literature?
I think I started to write when I was 5. I remember reading this book, and it was an orange book, and it was called The Radiant Way, and it said, Pat, sing to mother, mother, sing to Pat. And I looked at it and I thought, this is what I want to do. This is it. Because it meant that you didn't have to have people read you a story, you could actually do it. And I must have started writing as soon as I could read. And I went on writing all through my childhood, and all through boarding school, and all through university. I was writing this novel, and I was sitting in the front row of a lecture on D.H. Lawrence, and I was writing my novel. And the lecturer came up to me and he said, you don't need to take so many notes, it's not that interesting. And I was actually writing my novels. I just looked up at him. But I was very uncertain that anybody would ever publish it. It was just, compulsive writing. I never thought of myself as becoming a writer. I thought of myself as absolutely needing to write, which is different.
But you went to the academic life before you were published, I think.
I went to Cambridge. No, I did get a novel published before I became an academic. Becoming an academic was an accident. Possession was actually published when I was still quite young, and Still Life was published. And then I was offered a job at University College London, and I needed to pay school fees for children. And so I accepted the job, but I didn't really want the job. I wanted to be a writer. And then in those days, if you were teaching university, the writing wasn't anything. You had to hand in a list of your publications at the end of the academic year. And there were at least 3 writers in my department. There was Dan Jacobson and Stephen Spender and myself. And nothing that we wrote that wasn't academic was allowed to count as writing. So, which meant really you had a duty to write academic writing as well as to write the novel. And I had several small children, so it was very, very difficult. And I did like teaching. I loved the students and I loved the books.
Your only book that has been translated into Estonian is possession. So we just have to talk about it a little. It is actually, I think, several books in one book. There are so many layers, there are different time levels, different styles, different stories. How did you get the idea of writing such a book?
I think I must have had the idea about 8 years before I wrote the book, at least. And I got the idea most unusually. The first idea was the title. There was a very famous Coleridge scholar called Kathleen Coburn from Canada. And I used to sit in the British Museum round reading room. And she would be going round the catalogue working on Coleridge. And I thought, she doesn't ever do anything else. Her life is Coleridge's mind. And then the word came into my mind. I thought, does she possess him, or does he possess her? And since I loved Coleridge, I was slightly jealous of her because she possessed Coleridge. And then about 3 years later, it struck me that the word possession is also sexual. And then I saw that it could be layered, because there could be lovers in the 19th century and lovers in the 20th century. And then I had the idea that it would be a sort of rather Virginia Woolf-like book. You would glimpse the poems through the beautiful prose of the modern writing. And then it changed completely, really owing to my reading Umberto Eco. And I suddenly saw that this was not an Impressionist novel. It should have all the forms. It should be a detective story. And I used to read the romances of Georgette Heyer, and I thought, I can give it that shape. And I thought, if Eco can write a really big book about theology, because he's got Sherlock Holmes in it, then I can write a big book about the nature of poetry, providing it has a plot. So I started making this very complicated plot. And then it came to the problem that the message of the book is that poetry is more important than criticism, and more important than the biographies of poets. And this meant that the poetry should be present in the book. And the final moment really was when my editor then was a very important British poet called D.J. Enright, whom I loved. And he was at a party, slightly drunk, and I said, Dennis, I don't know what to do, because the poems should be in the book. And I perhaps take some from a minor poet in the 19th century. And he said, Antonia, you will write them yourself. And this is a true story. I went home and I started writing a poem to see if I could do it. And I found I could, and so I just wrote them. And they were written in order in the novel where they come. They are part of the text. I didn't sit with a box of poems on one side and a novel on the other. They are part of the line of the story.
But it's not the only love story, and not just love story with poems, actually, because to assume that means to simplify the book. You have also a lot to say about Victorian attitudes, their interest in natural sciences and Darwinism, and the conflict with religion and science.
Yes, I've got, I think a lot of my books are about that. I love the scientists, and I read modern scientists, and I read Darwin, and I used to teach Darwin. And I loved George Eliot very greatly. And I liked watching the sort of religious grip in the Victorian time get looser as the science became. And it was an immensely dramatic moment of history, really, when Darwin discovered evolution. And I can't put anything in a book unless I know a lot more than I put in. So I did an enormous amount of research.
And in places, the book is really funny when you describe the academic life and the life of literary critics. And are these scenes from your own experience in the academic life? For instance, the role of women academics.
Yes, that was, I was trying to remember when I wrote Possession, and I think one of the things I was slightly writing against was feminist criticism, because I was writing at a time when women scholars were trying to make women read nothing but women, and I thought this was a disaster. As I say, my most loved British novelist is George Eliot, but we had visiting scholars who wouldn't allow the women students to read sort of Shakespeare and Dickens, and they were just depriving them. It was terrible to see. And also, the history they were telling was slightly wrong, because I think in France and in Germany and in the United States, there were not so many good women writers. And so the critics told a story that said there were not good women writers because they were suppressed. There were always good women writers in Britain, and they were always read by both men and women, until we got this feminist structure which said that women mustn't read men. But that seems a long time ago now. This has stopped. It had a not very good effect on the British novel by women either, because the women got very anxious and thought they should be writing about women. And my own view is you can't write about women if you can't write about men. You have to write, there are people.
Yes, that's right, actually. That was actually the answer I got from William Boyd as well, that how can you write from the women's point of view, and he said that there is a human point of view.
Well, he must know a lot of women. I mean, you can't really talk to men if you don't have some idea
Yes.
who they are and how they think.
Now, maybe you can read a passage from Possession, and in this case we don't have to read it in Estonian, because Estonian text will be seen and can be read on the screens.
Do we know, will it know where I'm beginning?
Yes, I think so. At least what you told me, it was the discovery of the letters.
I've made it a bit shorter, so it begins on the next.
Yeah, it is fine.
It's okay?
It can be shorter.
Yes, it begins on page. This is the scene where the two modern researchers, a man and a woman, find the letters between the two Victorian poets, which they've just realized existed. And they're in a child's nursery in an old mansion. And I think that the rest of it's explanatory. They know that there were the letters, but they've only read two. Do you know, Roland said, turning to Sir George, whether there were papers? Is there anything left in that desk, anything of hers? That was cleared, I suppose, at her death, said Sir George. May we at least look, said Roland, imagining perhaps a hidden drawer, and at the same time uncomfortably aware of the laundry lists in Northanger Abbey. Sir George obligingly moved the light across to the desk, restoring the little faces to the dark where they had lain. These are the dolls in the doll's cot. Roland lifted the lid on a bare casket. There were empty arched pigeonholes at the back, fretted and carved, and two empty little drawers. He felt unable to tap and tug at the framework. He felt unable to urge the unbuckling of the trunk. He felt as though he was prying, and as though he was being uselessly urged on by some violent emotion of curiosity. Not greed, curiosity, more fundamental even than sex, the desire for knowledge. He felt suddenly angry with Maud, who was standing stock still in the dark, not moving a finger to help him, not urging, as she with her emotional advantage might well have done, further exploration of hidden treasures or pathetic dead caskets. Sir George said, "And what in particular might you expect to find?" Roland did not know the answer. Then behind him, chill and clear, Maud spoke a kind of incantation. Dolly keeps a secret, safer than a friend. Dolly's silent sympathy lasts without end. Friends may betray us, love may decay. Dolly's discretion outlasts our day. Could Dolly tell of us? Her wax lips are sealed. Much has she meditated, much, concealed. Dolly, ever sleepless, watches above the shreds and relics of our lost love, which her small fingers never may move. Dolly is harmless. We who did harm shall become chill as she, who now are warm. She mocks eternity with her sly charm. Sir George swung the light back onto the doll's cot. Very good, he said. Fantastic memory you've got. Never could learn anything by heart myself, barring Kipling and the Lincolnshire bits that amuse me, that is. What is it all about, though? It sounds in here like a treasure hunt clue, said Maud, still with a strained clarity, as though Dolly is hiding something. What might she be hiding, said Sir George. Almost anything, said Roland, suddenly wanting to put him off the trail. Keepsakes. Somebody's children must have had those dolls out, said their owner plausibly, since 1890. Maud knelt down in the dust. May I? He turned the light down on her. There she was, her face bending into shadow as though Latour had painted its waxiness. She reached into the cot and plucked out the blonde doll by the waist. Her gown was pink silk with little rosebuds round its neckline and tiny pearl buttons. She handed this creature to Roland, who took it that he might have done a kitten, cradling it in the crook of his elbow, and adding to it in turn the night-capped one, in tiny white pleats and broderie anglaise, and the dark-headed one, severe in dark peacock. They lay along his arm, their tiny heads heavy, their tiny limbs trailing, rather horrid, a little deathly. Maud took out the pillow, untucked the counterpane, folded away 3 fine woolen blankets and a crocheted shawl, and then lifted out one feather mattress and another, and a straw palliasse. She reached in under this, into the wooden box beneath it, prized up a hinged board, and brought out a package wrapped in fine white linen, tied with tape, about and about like a mummy. There was a silence. Maud stood there, holding on. Roland took a step forward. He knew what was wrapped away there. I'll stop.
Since I'm a publisher myself, such a question, when you handed in the manuscript, were the publishers very glad about all this imitated Victorian poetry and the rather complicated structure of the book?
No, they were not. And unfortunately, that happened at the only time when I didn't have a major writer as an editor. And so I had an editor who, he said he only read Gibbon and P.G. Wodehouse, so he was not the right editor for this book.
Yes.
And they got very angry. And they asked friends of mine to ring me up and ask me to take the poetry out. And I woke up every morning and my poor husband brought me cups of coffee and I just sat and wept because I knew it was good poetry. And they kept saying, you just can't have this. And finally, and the person they were making ring me up had also knew nothing about Victorian poetry. So I said, for God's sake, send it to somebody who knows about Victorian poetry. So they sent it to the novelist Alan Hollinghurst. And he said it was just like Wagner and it should be published as it. So that was all right in England, but nobody would publish it in America. And they wouldn't publish it in America. And they said I had to take out all the poems and the Victorian prose. And I said, I can't do that. You know, this book is what it is. I became really quite ill again. And then it won the Irish Times Prize. And then it won Booker. And then I said to my agent, all right, get it back. We can find some American publisher who will publish it. And then the publisher sent me some orchids. And then she said, you're making a great mistake, but I'll publish it as it is. And then I think she printed 7,000. This was sort of September. And she rang me up in November and said, guess what, we've sold 20,000. And I nearly fell over. And then in January, somebody rang me up from the New York Times and said, what is this book that sold 250,000 copies? So it did it by itself. And I never expected it to sell very well. I just thought it was a good book. And B, it sells very well all over the world. The Chinese read it and they love it. And why do people love a book about the nature of Victorian poetry in rather complicated English? It makes me very happy. And I think it's to do with Umberto Eco. It's because it's got a strong plot. He was right.
Yeah, of course, it has a very good plot, but it also has a peculiar charm, and I think maybe it is due to your use of fairy tales in it and legends, and you go to Bretagne and all these other things that Christopher writes, and it gives a certain different dimension to the whole thing.
It was an immense release for me because I had a puritanical upbringing, and I was at Cambridge in the days of Dr. Leavis when the novel was the highest form of human expression yet attained. I wrote an exam question on that, and I said, this is rubbish. There's science, there's painting, how can you say that? It's not good for the novel. And it was a mistake to write that. But I was a sort of serious person, and we were told that what you should do is describe modern British society and what is happening. And I wrote a series of 4 novels which did try to do that, among other things. And then Angela Carter, this was another of my moments of vision, said, I grew up on fairy stories, and actually those were much more important than any realistic fiction for children or adults. And I realized that so did I, and that the center of my life was actually fairy stories and myth. And then I was somehow released into writing Possession. And I had come to hate writing polite little sentences about people pouring themselves a cup of tea and discussing whether somebody might be persuaded to do something. I couldn't do it anymore. So I took to writing extravagant fairy tales, as well as in the novel. It was,
there was a certain set of myths and fairy tales, or myths actually, that probably had a strong influence on you, and it was Nordic mythology. How did you first meet it?
My mother gave us books. People keep asking me if my mother read to me, and I truly can't remember her doing so. But if I was bothered or anxious or worried or just a nuisance, she said, here, have another book. And one of the books she gave me was called Asgard and the Gods. And it was a book she'd had as a student at Cambridge when she was doing Anglo-Saxon and ancient Norse. And this was the book she'd been using to crib up the Norse mythology. And it was not written for children. It was written by a German scholar in, I think, the 1860s for German people who were interested in mythology. It all fitted onto Wagner, though I knew nothing about Wagner. And I must have read this book about once every 3 weeks. When I got to the end, I tried to read something else. And then I used to lie out of my bedroom on the landing on the floor on my stomach so that I could see by the light on the staircase. And if I heard my mother coming, I would rush back and get into the bed with the book. And I sort of lived in that book. And there was, another thing about it was that it was rather good for me because this German who had written it was clearly so wonderful and so interesting. And this was in the middle of the Second World War. And here was a German who was speaking to me, and that comforted me a little bit because I had this nightmare that the Germans were under my bed. And the Germans were sawing the legs off the bed. Where they got, I don't know why they were doing this, but when they got the bed to the ground, they would take me into the forest and lose me. And this was a horrible dream. So it was nice having this other German who was just telling me about the end of the world.
It was much more comforting, I think.
Yes.
But now you have written a book on this subject or on this theme.
The Canongate publishers were publishing a series of myths modernized by various writers. And a lot of the writers in the series have felt that what they were being asked to do was write a modern story with this ancient plot. Whereas I don't think you can do that very well with a myth. A myth is a myth. It has a form of a myth. And he said, would you like to write a myth? And I sort of thought of myself, and I said, of course, oh yes, I would like to write Ragnarok. And I don't think he knew what Ragnarok was, but he said, okay, you can write Ragnarok. So, and then it was quite hard to think how to write it, because it needed a language that wasn't modern English narrative. And then, so I put myself in as the thin child who was reading the book. And she doesn't have any other life. She just reads this book and goes to church, and that doesn't make her at all happy. And she walks through the English fields to school. But you don't see her family or her parents or anything. She just reads this book. And I got quite fond of her because she almost didn't exist. But she was me. She was a person who was primarily a reader, even when she was very little. And it worked quite well in the end, I think. The whole book is, if I could find a Nordic word, I would use it. And I tried to keep Latin and Greek words out. I mean, you can't completely because you have to write English, and English is wonderfully mixed up of all these things. But one of the things that the book is about is it tries very secretly to be about the extinction of species. I don't want to write a tract, but I spend much of my life now worrying about things that are dying. And it describes the snake Jörmungandr in the ocean. And it describes a little girl going through the English fields. And it doesn't say that all the flowers she sees are now extinct. She sees flowers that no, and in the sea, all the creatures which the snake slowly eats are mostly now extinct. But I did it that way, and it doesn't preach, but it's about the end of things.
So maybe you will give us a sample. I have heard you reading it once, and it was really very impressive. I still remember it.
Thank you. This is the passage out, my version of the passage out of the book about, there was a thing that came before Ragnarok, which was the death of the gods. There was a thing called the Fimbulwinter. Well, it must have been Fimbulwinter. And it came to the earth, and actually it never went away, but the people didn't know this. This is my description of the Fimbulwinter. It began slowly. There were flurries of sharp snow over the fields where the oats and barley were ready to be harvested. There was ice on the dew ponds at night when the harvest moon, huge and red, was still in the sky. There was ice on water jugs and an increasing thin, bitter wind that did not let up, so that they became used to keeping their heads hooded and down. There was a wonderful harvest of frosted grapes to make the Moselle wine, the ice vine, which was put down in casks. Winter vegetables wilted on their stems, frozen before they were plump. The leaves in the woods and forests fell early and blew about in the eddies of bitter wind. The light at first was clear and cold. Things glittered, ice in the cart tracks, icicles growing on sills and bushes, and not shrinking, not melting, thrusting on. Then, as winter set in, the sky darkened. It was full of thick, iron-grey clouds, full of snow, and the air itself was full of snow and hail and ice splinters eddying. The surface of the earth hardened, shrinking and dense, frozen too deep for spades to disturb. Root vegetables could not be lifted, could not be disinterred. Ice thickened on lakes and spread sluggishly into the courses of rivers. Fish went down and down, swimming at first under the ice shelves, then settling into the mud, cold and limp, barely breathing. Men went out with axes and hacked off buckets of ice to melt in the house for drinking. At first, this excited them. It was a test of strength, a test of manhood. Cattle were enclosed and the sheep brought in, those who did not die in the drifts which rose higher and did not diminish. Hens came into houses and pigs lay by the hearth. Men went out in snowshoes and skis and sledges and took down trees for firewood and hunted the increasingly furtive and cunning wood creatures, rabbits and hares, small deer and partridges, small fowl with their feet frozen to the twigs in the bushes. They needed to survive until the spring, until the days at last grew longer and the sun would melt the snow and the ice and the wind would die down and skins could be in the air without being frostbitten. The shortest day came and the humans danced, stamping in the snow, and made bonfires to greet the turn of the year. But the year did not exactly turn. The sky became a paler grey, that was all, and the earth and the air and the water stayed icy. They began to use things that could not be replaced. The pig's throat was slit and it was butchered and frozen and roasted. Those hens that did not lay were strangled and plucked and boiled and were not replaced because most chicks died. Feeding the sheep and the horses and donkeys became hard, very hard, because of the ruined crops and the frozen fields. Courage became endurance, and soup was needed too much to be fed to the dying. Outside, in the perpetual twilight, wolves howled and padded. They were hungry and angry. This, they thought, was how it would be when the Fimbulwinter came. The fat sun was dull red, sullen like embers. She gave little light, and what there was ruddy or bloody. They longed in their bones and their brains for clear light, for a warm wind, for buds, for green leaves. The winter stretched into another year, and another. The seas froze. Icebergs clashed by the coasts and floated into the bays. This was, they began to understand, not a likeness of the Fimbulwinter, but the thing itself. They became raiders. They overran each other's housesteads, howling and roaring, slaughtering the weak and emptying the meagre stores. They drank what mead there was, swallowed the wine as though there was no tomorrow, which they began to believe was true. Hungry creatures, hungry men, will eat anything. The battle winners feasted among the dead bodies, which were being torn at by creeping, crouching beasts. They gripped each other and fell about the fire, fornicating with whomever was to hand, with whatever was to hand. They bit and kissed and chewed and swallowed and fought and struggled and waited for the world to end, which it did not yet. They ate each other, of course, in the end. The skies thickened and thickened. Things, geezers, leathery winged female things, wailed in the wind and perched on the crags, staring and screaming. Nidhögg, the great worm who gnawed the roots of Yggdrasil, came out and sucked the blood from the dead as they lay in the freezing slime. From the kettlewood, where Loki lay bound amongst the geysers, which still spouted hot, came a louder howl of wolves. Wolves in the wood, wolves padding over the snow, wolves with blood on their fangs, wolves in the mind. Wind time, wolf time, before the world breaks up.
I still want to ask about the book you wrote before Ragnarök, actually, the children's book. It is also somehow connected to all the fairy stories and children's stories and the way people started maybe to write for children. It was different suddenly by the end of the 19th century. What?
It was at the end of the reign of Queen Victoria, at the beginning of the reign of Edward VII. And suddenly in Britain, there was they wrote articles at that time saying our greatest writers are actually writers for children. The Wind in the Willows, Kenneth Grahame, E. Nesbit. And those were the children's books, of course, I read when I was a child. I lived in those books. And I started researching them, and I discovered a very inconvenient but interesting fact, which is that the children of people who write for children kill themselves. Statistically more than they ought to. I hope there are no children's writers present, and I'm sure it no longer happens, but I mean, there was this boy, the son of Kenneth Grahame, for whom The Wind in the Willows was written when I was a child. I thought, how wonderful to have this being written for you. This boy never found a place in the world. He didn't know who he was. He finally went to Oxford. He couldn't, in fact, see very well, and his parents refused to believe that he couldn't see and wouldn't take him to a doctor. And one day, he sat in his college and, unusually for him, drank 2 glasses of port. And he went out and took his coat off and lay on the railway and waited for the train to go over him. And his father said it was an accident. And there were many other stories like that of children's writers. The only theory I can form, and I don't think it's right, is that the children's writer actually is trying to prolong their own childhood. And there is no room in the childhood of the children's writer for an actual real child who needs a grown-up. So that was the germ of it. I started, and I needed a writer with an enormous family because of telling the stories to the children. So I started from there. And I think people think I dislike her because she wrote compulsively, and she in fact earned the money in her household because her husband was a political journalist who didn't earn very much. So she was the breadwinner, and those women who wrote those stories, they were the breadwinner. But they were the breadwinner by sitting there writing rather than making tea for their children. And most of them had another woman, or this one had a sister who did the looking after the children. But it sort of spread out into an image of a whole society. And again, I did a lot of research and found things out. And I am not historically very clever. And I was quite into the planning of this book before I started writing down the year. I began in 1890 something. And I suddenly realized all these children are going to get killed in the First World War. And I hadn't thought of that, so there was no First World War in my original image of this childhood book. And I then decided to write it so that it never looks forward. It tells what happens, but it never says, and then she was to, or 10 years later he might. It just tells it. And then the First World War hits them the way I think it did hit people. There were men in the city sort of writing letters to Germany about stocks and shares while war was being declared. People just didn't know it was coming. And then I thought, now, do I just stop there, or do I tell people what happened to the children who got in the war? And I thought, if I were a reader, I would never forgive somebody who didn't tell me. So I put it all in, but briefly, the war is quite short.
Most of your novels are big books. There is an intricate plot and lots of pages. And we live in an age where people say that they read less and less, and their span of attention shortens all the time. So what do you think, what would be the future of such novels, actually? Are they half dead, or are they thriving, in fact?
My own view is that they're thriving. Mm-hmm. As I say, I went to China, and they said, come into this building, you can talk to an audience. And there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. There wasn't just one. And they had read the book. And they read books. They read all sorts of other things, and they had iPads. But I don't think it's going to become a specialist thing. I think it's just something we say. And I now couldn't write novels without Wikipedia. I love Wikipedia because all the things I now forget, as long as I can think. I looked up Kropotkin this afternoon because I forgot him, and I knew I'd forgotten him. And I couldn't write without Wikipedia, but I don't use Wikipedia instead of a novel. It's different. And I think I think the people who use Facebook instead of novels are just a different kind of animal. They're not the people who used to read books.
They were different all the time, yes?
Mm.
Okay. So, are you writing anything just now?
I'm writing a very big book, yes.
Mm-hmm. Another very big book.
Yes, I'm writing a novel which starts, when does it start? It starts in 1918, so in a sense it follows on from the children's book. Mm-hmm. And it's a novel about psychoanalysts and surrealists. It got to be that by accident. I thought I would write a novel about psychoanalysts because I thought it would linguistically be very interesting. And I was interested in the fact that they're a group with a leader and people are always being pushed out at the edge of the group. And then I had to write an article about surrealists and fashion. So I said to my editor, it might be interesting to write a novel about surrealists instead of psychoanalysts. And she said, oh yes. And so then I was upset. I thought she doesn't want the novel about the psychoanalysts. And then I went home and I thought, actually, I shall die at the end of this novel because it's a long novel and I'm old. So I'll have to put the psychoanalysts into the novel with the surrealists. And then I realized that, in fact, both of them were products of the First World War in many ways. And both of them were interested in the dark and in dreams and in the unreal life. And then I began to get a shape, which I now find very exciting. There's an awful lot, there's an enormous amount more to do than I've done.
Yeah, but I think it is something really to look forward to.
I hope I finish it.
So, thank you, and now I hope there will be questions from the audience. Any questions?
Ma täiega tropin siin ukse peal ja mu kõhutunne ütleb, et ta on tegelikult küünarnuki tunne, aga ma katsun siit läbi pääseda ja anda mikrofoni nendele mõnele õnnelikule, kellel on veel võimalik küsimust esitada. Nii, kes tahab küsida midagi? Saab kohe mikrofoni. Eestlased? Ei ole eestlane.
Thank you so much for the reading that you gave of Ragnarok. That's the last book of yours I read. And I'd like to ask a question about the language in the book, because I had exactly the same response now listening to you read it as I did first time. I actually get goosebumps listening to that particular one. And I felt in many of your novels that I've read that, you don't describe, you don't present, you don't show, that the language acts. And I wonder if that's something that you're aware of, that just comes naturally to you. You talked about the Victorian poetry, but in this particular book I felt it very strongly, and I just wondered if you could say something about that.
I realized it needed a different language. I think it needed a language that was talking to more than one person. I've always felt that the novel, as such, is a relationship between two people. It's a relationship between the writer and the reader. And one of the really strange things about writing novels like Possession is that you're talking to one person at a time, and all of them will read something different. But if you're writing a myth, you actually need a kind of common language. You need a language, a storytelling language that talks to everybody and nobody. And I've always had that language in my head since I was a child, and I've never known what to do with it, because I don't write epics and I don't write poetry that isn't in a novel. I can't do it. But this had to be kind of active language, and in some ways I suppose it's in fact derived from language that existed before people read. It's not exactly spoken language, but it's got a kind of almost religious structure to it. I would like to tell everybody to read Memorial, which is a poem by a British woman poet called Alice Oswald. And she has taken Homer's language and written Homer, but only about the common soldiers. She's done exactly that. She's found this strange public language, and it's very, very beautiful and quite extraordinary. And the structure is weird. And I've heard her read it, but she doesn't read because she knows it all by heart, because she says it's in the structure of her brain. And this is amazing. And I think this is something a bit like that, only I hadn't thought it out as well as she had.
Suur aitäh ja kas on veel küsimusi paistmas siitpoolt? Nii.
Ma küsiksin eesti keeles. Et kui te kirjutate, siis suur osa kindlasti kirjutamisel on fantaasial. Aga te ütlesite ka, et te teete nagu uurimustööd, et kui suur osa on sellel uurimustööl kirjutamise juures?
While writing, of course, fantasy and imagination play quite a big role, but you also said that you do a lot of research. How big is research part in your writing?
It's enormous because I like to get things right. And also, I was at a meeting in the Royal Society of Literature in London, and a lady novelist said, of course, you must never do any research for a novel. A novel has nothing to do with research. The research gives me all the aesthetic structures, it gives me the language, it gives me things which I can then arrange, and it gets me out of myself. I think that's the most important thing. I don't like writing about myself very much, and I think I could never write a first-person novel. I think it would make me feel ill. I like looking out into the world to see what else there is. And the research, I mean, the research completely changes what you're writing because you didn't know what happened until you go along and find out. I've been doing a lot of work on Freud, and I discovered all sorts of things about Freud. And just one strange fact I discovered writing the novel I'm writing. There's a sort of leitmotif has turned up in the novel of life-size dolls. Kokoschka made a life-size doll of Alma Mahler with whom he was in love. And then there was a psychoanalyst who was analyzing the shell-shocked. And he gave the common soldiers a life-size doll made up as an officer so they could beat it up. And then they were able to tell him why they were so desperate. And there were life-size dolls in Dada, Berlin, hanging from the ceiling in the cafes. Well, if I hadn't done the research, I wouldn't have known this. I wouldn't have invented the life. And once you start looking for life-size dolls, they're all over. And that's one I mean, there are all sorts of things in my novels that are rather like that. You find them once you see that they excite you. I remember saying once to an audience, you know, I'm reading along and things glitter at me. And somebody in the audience was really annoyed with me, and she said, "What do you mean, glitter?" And I look at the page, and I'm not reading it as I would be if I was writing an academic essay. I'm looking for something that means something to me for the structure I'm making. And it does actually sort of shine on the page and slightly shiver. And then I have enormous notebooks, and I write things in the notebooks. And then I make an index on the computer of the things I've written in the notebooks so I can find them again. And then if you read the index, you suddenly see what the novel's about because all the things are in the index. But it does take a long time. But I do enjoy it.
Nii, ma ei tea, kell näitab, et aeg on daamid vabaks lasta ja siis jääb tõepoolest väga väike hetkeke, et tõmmata hinge või suitsu või juttu või midagi kiiret rindu ja 5 minuti pärast jätkame Eesti meesterahvastega, kes räägivad asjadest, mis ei ole luule, aga praegu AS Byatt, Krista Kaer, suur aitäh, thank you so much.